In the far reaches of space, where stars flicker like dying embers and the void whispers its ancient secrets, there's a legend, a story that has haunted the deepest corridors of the galaxy for centuries. It is the tale of a ship once feared by every spacefaring race, a pirate vessel that defied death and lived on in infamy, the Black Pearl. But now it drifts in silence. The Aegis, a massive starship commissioned by the Galactic Marine Corps, is tasked with investigating the mysterious signal that's been broadcasting from the derelict Black Pearl. Officially, it's a routine mission: scout the vessel, assess any dangers, and report back. But for the squad of Marines aboard the Aegis, nothing could prepare them for what they would find. As they approach the Pearl, they're struck by the eerie sight of a ship that shouldn't be there. Frozen in time, a ghostly relic suspended. In the darkness, it's a ship that time has abandoned, its crew long since dead, its power systems somehow still operational. But what if they never truly left? What if the Black Pearl still carries the weight of its cursed past, waiting for new souls to claim? The Aegis will soon discover that the past doesn't stay dead in the darkness of space. Some ghosts never leave. The stars shone bright in the vast expanse of space, but the Aegis was a mere speck, gliding through the abyss toward a nightmare that had been drifting out there for centuries. The ship's hull groaned as it cut through the vacuum, the sleek, metallic body as steadfast as the men and women aboard. Sergeant Alejandro Ramirez stood in the bridge, staring out through the massive viewport at the looming shape of the Black Pearl. A ship so infamous, its name carried the weight of legends. Pirate's death, a cursed vessel drifting alone in space. And yet there it was, visible in every detail, the jagged edges of the hull, the broken sails that seemed to flutter without wind, and the eerie stillness that hung around it. Still don't understand why they're sending us on this. Corporal Jenna Ortega muttered from the tactical console, her sharp gaze scanning the readings. This is a dead ship. Who knows how many years it's been out here? The Pearl isn't even supposed to exist anymore. Ramirez grunted, his fingers tapping against the railing of the bridge. It's not our job to ask why, Ortega. We're here to do what we're told, nothing more. The briefing they'd received had been brief, too brief in Ramirez's opinion. A pirate ship lost in the endless reaches of space, found after decades of silence, with a strange signal that seemed to emanate from it. No survivors, no signs of life, yet something about it felt wrong, like the pulse of a heart that shouldn't be beating. Approaching the Black Pearl, Sergeant, Lieutenant Grayson called from the navigation station, his voice steady but tinged with something harder to place, an edge perhaps, or curiosity. We're locking in now. Good. All teams prepare for boarding, Ramirez ordered. Gear up. We don't know what we're walking into. His voice was authoritative, but a flicker of unease nagged at the back of his mind. The crew had been briefed on the basics, but no one was under any illusions. They weren't stepping onto a luxury cruiser. They were entering a tomb. Ramirez ran his fingers over the holomap of the Black Pearl as it flickered to life on the bridge's main screen. The pirate ship was a relic, its design anachronistic, long, jagged and dark, like something out of a forgotten time. The image was grainy, and the scan results only made the mystery more unnerving. The ship's power systems were operational, but there were no signs of life. The Aegis began to slow its descent toward the Pearl's docking bay, a spacious cavern of metal and ruin. It was a place where no ship had docked in ages, and yet the doors to the Pearl's entryway were wide open, as if inviting them in. Ramirez exchanged a glance with Lieutenant Grayson. The silence in the air was thick. They both understood the gravity of what they were about to do. The docking sequence took only minutes, but to Ramirez, it felt like an eternity. His mind wandered to the legends he'd heard as a child, tales of the Black Pearl and its cursed crew. Old stories, of course, but ones that had stuck with him. Even now, with the years behind him, there was something chilling in those stories, something more than the simple scrawl of an old myth. When the final clank of metal against metal signaled the docking bay, Ramirez nodded to his team. "Prepare for entry. Remember, stay in formation and keep your comms open. We don't know what's waiting for us." The team, Ramirez, Ortega, Grayson, and 4 others, clad in full tactical gear, boarded the airlock. The cold weight of the ship's abandoned halls greeted them as they stepped onto the Black Pearl. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of age and dust. The walls were scarred, as if battles had been fought here long ago. Yet there was no sign of life, no sounds except the faint hum of ancient systems struggling to stay alive. "Looks like it's been abandoned for centuries," Grayson muttered, scanning the surroundings. "How is this thing still running? "Doesn't matter," Ramirez replied. "We're here to confirm the signal and clear out. If there's anything dangerous here, we neutralize it. Simple." Ortega tapped her helmet, her eyes narrowing. "Don't know about you, but I don't. Like how quiet it is. It feels off." Ramirez ignored her, focusing instead on the hall ahead. The Black Pearl's interior was like an ancient cathedral, filled with strange symbols and markings that made no sense in any modern language. The air was thick with a kind of oppressive stillness that weighed heavily on their hearts. The deeper they moved into the ship, the stranger it became. Odd doors that led nowhere, hallways that curved in impossible angles, and strange, almost animalistic sounds echoing from the depths. It wasn't a ship. It was a mausoleum, an altar to death itself. Then they found it, the bridge. It was cold, darker than the rest of the ship. As they stepped inside, Ortega stopped, her hand frozen on her weapon. "Sarge, look!" At the center of the room, an ancient captain's chair sat in front of a long console, now cracked and rusted. But the chair was facing them, empty but somehow still filled with a presence. "Not alone," Ortega whispered, her voice tense. "We aren't alone." Ramirez turned to her, his gut tightening. Something was wrong. He couldn't explain it, but he could feel the pulse of death in the air, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the ship. "Let's finish this," he ordered. But even as the words left his mouth, he realized it was too late. The Black Pearl had awakened. The Black Pearl was a ship of contradictions. On the surface, it seemed like any other derelict relic in space, old, broken, and abandoned by time. Yet as the Marines ventured deeper into its shadowy corridors, the ship seemed almost alive. Every creak of metal, every gust of stale air felt like the ship was breathing, whispering. It was a haunting presence that none of them could shake, no matter how many times they reassured themselves that it was nothing more than an abandoned vessel, a ghost of the past. But there was something else, something unexplainable. The Marines advanced cautiously through the corridors, their weapons drawn and their sensors scanning for any signs of life. It was a slow, methodical process. They had been trained to expect the worst, but nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to find. "Clear!" Ramirez's voice echoed through his comms as he surveyed the empty hallways. "Move up!" The rest of the squad followed, their footsteps muffled against the cold metallic floor. Every turn they took seemed to lead them deeper into the ship's bowels, where shadows clung to the walls like dark memories. There were no bodies, no blood, nothing to suggest that this had been a place of conflict or violence. Yet the air was thick with an unsettling stillness, as if the Black Pearl had swallowed the very essence of time itself. "Sergeant, you seeing this?" Ortega's voice crackled through the comms, sharp and tense. "These markings on the walls, they're not just graffiti." Ramirez glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he approached the door where Ortega was stationed. The wall, was covered in strange symbols, an unfamiliar script that pulsed faintly, almost as if it were alive. The writing was ancient, its lines curved in unnatural patterns, as if drawn by a hand not human. There was something hypnotic about it, and Ramirez felt his pulse quicken as he traced the symbols with his gaze. "Looks like some kind of alien language," Grayson said, his voice tinged with disbelief. He stepped forward, inspecting the markings more closely. "But I've never seen anything like this. It doesn't fit any known species script." "It's not human, that much is clear," Ramirez replied, trying to ignore the creeping sense of unease settling over him. "Let's keep moving." But something in his gut told him that the markings weren't just some relic of a forgotten civilization. They were a warning that had been left for a reason. The Black Pearl had once belonged to a crew of ruthless pirates, but now it was more than just a ship. It was a prison, a tomb. As they pushed deeper into the ship, the silence became oppressive, almost suffocating. It felt as though they were walking through a dream, a nightmare to be precise, one that was built on the memories of something long dead. Yet as they passed through another hallway, Ramirez caught something in the corner of his eye, a flicker, a shadow moving against the walls, too fast to be human. "Did anyone else see that?" Ortega asked, her voice tight. Ramirez froze, his hand instinctively going to his sidearm. He scanned the area, but there was nothing, only darkness. The flickering light above them buzzed intermittently, casting erratic shadows across the walls. "I didn't see anything," Grayson replied, his voice laced with skepticism. "Maybe a glitch in the lights." "Stay alert," Ramirez ordered, though his voice held a note of unease he couldn't quite shake. The deeper they went, the more the ship seemed to shift around them. The Pearl was no longer a static, abandoned vessel. It felt like something was watching them. Every step they took seemed to echo louder in the stillness, every breath heavier in the air. It was as if the ship itself had come to life, its walls closing in, its corridors narrowing. The temperature began to drop, and Ramirez could see his breath misting in the air. "We're getting close," Ramirez muttered, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "Let's move." They rounded another corner, and this time there was something different. The hallway ended in a massive chamber, a grand, open space that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were lined with broken statues, old relics of a long-forgotten time. But it wasn't the artifacts that drew Ramirez's attention. It was the figure standing in the center of the room, a tall, gaunt man, dressed in tattered pirate garb. His face, obscured by shadows, stared back at them from the center of the room. His eyes, however, glowed faintly, a sickly green light that seemed to burn with a hunger of its own. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. "What the hell?" Ortega gasped, raising her weapon. "Don't shoot," Ramirez hissed, his voice low and urgent. "Stay calm." But it was too late. The figure began to move, slowly, like a marionette jerked by unseen strings. The pirate stepped forward, his hollow eyes never leaving the Marines. "Captain," Grayson whispered under his breath, "this is—" But the figure didn't respond. Instead, he raised a hand, his skeletal fingers beckoning them forward. A low, guttural sound filled the air, a whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "You're too late." The words sent a chill racing down Ramirez's spine. The whisper wasn't just a voice, it was a command, an invitation, a death sentence. And then the ship seemed to react. The walls shook, a low hum reverberating through the air, growing louder and louder until it was a roar. The lights flickered and buzzed, casting the room in an otherworldly glow. Ramirez could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as the figure's presence grew stronger. It wasn't just a ghost, this was something more, something ancient, and it was waiting for them. "Retreat!" Ramirez shouted, his voice full of urgency. "Get to the extraction point now!" But as they turned to flee, the doors to the chamber slammed shut with an ear-splitting crash. The ship had locked them in. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness. Then the walls began to pulse with light, and the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were coming from everywhere. "You cannot escape." Ramirez's heart pounded in his chest as the floor beneath them seemed to shift, as if the very foundation of the ship was alive, twisting, turning. The Black Pearl had no intention of letting them leave, and in that moment, Ramirez understood. This was not just a haunted ship, it was a prison, and they were its latest captives. As the Marines scrambled to find an exit, the pirate captain, appeared again, standing at the far end of the chamber. But this time his eyes weren't just glowing. They were filled with rage, a burning fury that seemed to emanate from him like an inferno. "You are mine," the captain hissed, his voice like 1,000 voices speaking as one. And just like that, Ramirez felt it. The pressure, the weight, the overwhelming sense of dread that came with the realization that they were no longer in control. The Black Pearl was alive, and it was hungry. The Black Pearl was no longer just a haunted ship. It had become something worse, something that reached deep into the souls of the Marines, probing, pulling, bending their very minds to its will. The figure of the pirate captain had vanished, but the oppressive silence remained, only broken by the constant hum of the ship's failing systems. It was as if the Pearl itself was breathing, each breath laced with a dark energy that threatened to crush them from all sides. Sergeant Ramirez led the way, his grip tight around his weapon, his senses on high alert. The ship had locked them in, an act of will that could only have come from something far more malevolent than a simple ghost. It was a force, ancient and powerful, that seemed to twist the very fabric of space itself. "We can't stay here," Ortega said, her voice trembling. She was the youngest of the squad, and her nerves were clearly starting to fray. The walls were closing in, pressing down on them with a weight that seemed to be coming from all directions. "We need to get to the airlock now." "Stay focused," Ramirez barked, his tone hard. "We don't know what we're dealing with. Move with purpose." The squad moved in tight formation, weapons raised, every creak of the ship's metal echoing through the corridors like the footfalls of something far larger, far older. The Pearl seemed to have a life of its own, and it wasn't done with them yet. "Something's not right," Grayson muttered from the rear, his eyes darting nervously as he scanned the surrounding shadows. "I keep hearing things. Whispers." Ramirez didn't respond. He had heard them too, the soft murmurs that drifted through the walls, the faint echoes of voices that weren't there. The closer they got to the heart of the ship, the louder the whispers became, like a symphony of voices in pain, crying out for release. The group rounded a corner, weapons aimed forward. They were in the ship's lower levels now, an area that seemed more cramped, the ceiling low and oppressive. The walls were covered in the same cryptic symbols as before, but now there were other marks too. Scratches, gouges, and slashes that looked like they had been made by something far more violent. "They were here," Ortega whispered, pointing to the walls. Her voice was shaky, and her words seemed to hang in the air, thick with dread. "The crew of the Black Pearl, they left something behind." "Focus," Ramirez repeated, though his own voice was tight, strained. He had a bad feeling about this. Everything felt wrong, as though the ship were leading them somewhere, manipulating their every step. Suddenly, one of the Marines, a young private named Jacobs, stopped in his tracks. His eyes were wide, and his breath came in quick, shallow gasps. He was staring down a narrow hallway that led to a set of heavy steel doors, but there was something else. "Something moving!" "Sergeant, there's someone in there," Jacob stammered, pointing toward the doors. His hand was shaking. Ramirez took a step forward, his mind racing. There was nothing visible, nothing that should have been there. But the air in the hallway seemed to pulse, the temperature dropping rapidly. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, the ship pressing in on them from every side. "Stay alert," Ramirez ordered, moving forward cautiously. His boots clicked softly against the metal floor, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence. When they reached the doors, Ramirez paused, his hand on the handle. There was a heavy, metallic scent in the air, like rust and decay. It was nauseating. Ramirez pushed the doors open with a slow, deliberate motion. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by flickering emergency lights. The walls were lined with more strange symbols, but in the center of the room, a large table stood. A table that was stained, dark with something that could only be blood. And on that table, something moved. "God help us," Jacobs whispered. Ramirez's gaze followed the young Marine's line of sight, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. There, lying on the table, was a figure, a woman, her body skeletal and covered in black rags, her eyes wide open, staring at nothing. Her skin was gray, stretched tight against her bones, and her lips were cracked in a permanent silent scream. But what made Ramirez's stomach turn was the way her body moved. It wasn't natural. It was as if the woman was trying to speak, her lips twitching in silent agony, her hands clawing at the table as if she were trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. "What the hell is this?" Grayson whispered. Ramirez didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the woman, his mind reeling. He knew this wasn't just a hallucination. This wasn't just the ship playing tricks on them. This was real. This was a part of the curse, a relic of the Black Pearl's dark past. Suddenly, the woman's head snapped up, her empty eyes locking onto Ramirez. The movement was unnatural, grotesque. And then she spoke. "You're too late." The voice was a rasp, a broken whisper, but it was unmistakable. Ramirez felt his heart skip a beat, his blood turning cold. "We have to go," Ortega hissed, grabbing Ramirez's arm and pulling him away from the table. "Now." But it was too late. The moment Ortega touched him, a shockwave of energy shot through the room, knocking the Marines off their feet. The walls seemed to warp and bend, and the lights flickered wildly. The woman's body convulsed, her limbs twitching violently as if possessed by some unseen force. From the corners of the room, the shadows began to shift, coalescing into something darker, more solid. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. "You can't leave. You're part of it now." The squad scrambled to their feet, but it was as if the ship itself was alive, pushing against them, pressing them into the corners of the room. The shadows closed in, and the temperature dropped even further. Ramirez's breath misted in front of him as he turned to face his squad. "Get to the extraction point," he shouted. "Now!" But the door slammed shut before they could reach it, trapping them inside. The walls began to close in, the shadows reaching for them with skeletal hands. "Sergeant, we're not going to make it!" Ortega gasped, her voice breaking. She was backing away from the table, her eyes wide with terror. And then the ship seemed to roar. A deafening sound, like the screams of 1,000 souls, echoed through the walls. The shadows enveloped them, and the Black Pearl seemed to scream its fury. The last thing Ramirez saw before everything went black was the woman's face, her eyes locked onto his, her mouth open in a silent scream, and then nothing. Ramirez snapped awake, his eyes wide, heart racing. His breath came in ragged gasps, the cold metal floor pressing against his back. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. Everything was disorienting, like waking from a nightmare, only to realize that the nightmare hadn't ended. The darkness surrounding him was suffocating, heavy with an almost tangible dread. He shot to his feet, his pulse hammering in his ears. His squad. Where were they? "Ortega," he called hoarsely, his voice a raspy whisper in the dark. No answer. Panic flickered in his chest, but he squashed it down. He couldn't afford to panic, not now. The Black Pearl had taken control of the air, and if they were going to make it out alive, they needed to stay sharp. Ramirez's helmet had cracked in the previous blast, but he could still hear his squad's comms buzzing faintly. "Grayson?" Ramirez called again, louder this time. "Jacobs? Anyone?" The comms crackled, the static a reminder of how far. They were from help. The eerie silence around him pressed in on all sides, and every creak of the ship sent his nerves into overdrive. The last thing Ramirez remembered before the darkness had taken him was the woman on the table. Her eyes. Those hollow, desperate eyes. She had been trying to warn them, but he hadn't understood. "You're too late," she had said. What did that mean? Was it the ship? Was it the curse? He had to find his squad. Ramirez stumbled to his feet, scanning the shadowy corridor. The walls of the Black Pearl seemed to twist and stretch in ways that defied logic, the markings on the walls pulsating as though they were alive, following his every movement. The ship felt more alive than ever now, every surface crawling with a presence that was too strong to ignore. He forced himself to take a breath, steadying himself as best as he could. "Focus," he muttered under his breath. He was a soldier, not some frightened kid. The mission was clear: find his squad. "Get out!" The ship groaned as if acknowledging his thoughts. The lights flickered once more, casting long, shuddering shadows across the walls. The sounds were growing louder now, whispers that came from everywhere, though no one was visible. The whispers were becoming more distinct, more personal. "Alejandro!" Ramirez's stomach clenched. The voice wasn't his own, but it was unmistakable. A low rasp that curled through his ears like a serpent. He turned quickly, scanning the darkness around him. There was no one there, but the voice, it had come from within his mind. His breath quickened and he shook his head, trying to clear it. "It's the ship," he thought. "It's messing with me." "Get a hold of yourself," he muttered aloud, trying to steady his thoughts. "Stay focused. You need to find the others." The walls around him seemed to stretch and pull, their angles becoming increasingly erratic. Ramirez stumbled, disoriented, as he tried to push forward. The door to a nearby room opened on its own, with a soft hiss. It felt almost like an invitation. Ramirez stepped cautiously into the room, gun raised. It was a narrow, low-ceiling chamber, cluttered with old equipment and long-forgotten machinery. But there, in the far corner, something moved. "Ortega," Ramirez's voice cracked as he called out. The figure turned slowly, and for a moment, Ramirez thought he'd found her. But the person in front of him was no longer his teammate. The face was wrong. Hollow eyes stared back at him, glowing faintly green. The skin was stretched thin across the skull, as if someone had peeled it back. Ramirez raised his weapon instinctively, but the figure didn't move. Instead, it spoke, its voice a rasping whisper. "You are all mine." Before Ramirez could react, the figure lunged toward him, but just as quickly it vanished, fading into the walls like smoke. Ramirez froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The figure hadn't just vanished. It had become the Black Pearl, a part of the ship itself. He wasn't dealing with simple ghosts. The ship was alive, and it was toying with them. Ramirez's mind raced. Where was Ortega? Where was Grayson? The whispers had already begun to claw at his mind, and he knew they couldn't afford to get separated. Whatever this ship was, it was feeding on their fear, their confusion. They had to stick together, or they wouldn't make it out alive. He heard a faint noise from down the hallway, a voice, a scream. It was unmistakably Ortega. She was in trouble. "Ortega!" Ramirez shouted, taking off in the direction of the sound. His legs burned, and his heart hammered in his chest. The air in the corridor was getting thicker, the temperature dropping with every step. It felt as though the ship was constricting around him, trapping him in its cold, suffocating embrace. As Ramirez rounded the corner, he skidded to a halt. Ortega was there, but she wasn't the same. She was slumped, against the wall, her head hanging low, her body trembling. Her eyes were wide, but they weren't focused on him. She wasn't alone. A figure stood before her, a tall man, gaunt and pale, wearing tattered pirate garb. His face was twisted in a grin that was more skeletal than human. The faint green glow of his eyes flickered like dying embers. You didn't listen," the pirate captain hissed, his voice coming from the very air around them. It wasn't just one voice. It was hundreds of voices speaking as one, layered over each other like an endless cacophony of souls in torment. Ortega gasped, her breath shallow and ragged. She was frozen in place, unable to move. The whispers were overwhelming, like 1,000 hands pulling at her consciousness, slowly erasing everything she knew. Ramirez's hands shook as he aimed his weapon, but the pirate captain raised a skeletal, and his fingers curling in an almost mocking gesture. The temperature in the corridor dropped even further, and Ramirez felt the walls close in on him, pressing him to the floor. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, clawing at his mind. "You are ours now." A flicker of light in the distance. It caught his attention, a movement, a shadow in the corner of his eye. It wasn't just the pirate captain anymore. The ship had come alive, its ghosts were walking among them, feeding on their terror, pulling them deeper into the abyss. "Ortega!" Ramirez shouted again, but it was no use. She didn't respond. She was lost, consumed by the ship's curse. Ramirez took a deep breath, steadying himself as best as he could. He couldn't afford to lose his focus. If he let the Black Pearl take his mind too, they were all lost. The ship wasn't just haunted, it was a parasite, feeding on the souls of the dead, and now it was after them. The question was no longer how they could escape. The question was whether any of them would be allowed to leave. The whispers grew louder, closing in like a tidal wave, drowning out everything else. The Pearl was taking them, one by one, erasing them, just as it had erased its original crew, and Ramirez was next. Ramirez had never been one to show fear, not in the face of enemy fire, not in the midst of impossible odds. But this was different. What he was facing was beyond anything he had ever been trained for. The Black Pearl wasn't a battlefield. It wasn't a place where tactics and firepower could win the day. It was a prison, a nightmare. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were everywhere now, inside his mind, crawling beneath his skin, as if the very ship had sunk its claws into his thoughts. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the pirates who had once called this vessel home, those gaunt, hollow-eyed figures who were both dead and not dead, bound by some cursed force that he was only beginning to understand. They weren't just figments of the ship's dark energy. They were memories, echoes of the past, pulling at his sanity like leeches. Ortega was still gone, and he could feel her presence, or rather the absence of it, lingering like a shadow. She hadn't been taken by the Pearl. She was still there, somewhere, but she was lost. The ship had claimed her just as it had claimed every soul that had ever sailed its cursed halls. The sound of footsteps echoed through the corridors, and Ramirez stiffened. For a moment he wondered if he was hearing things, but the footsteps grew louder and his instincts flared. They were real, and they were coming for him. He spun around, his weapon raised, but there was nothing. No enemy to fire at, no ambush, waiting in the dark. The corridor stretched before him, silent and empty, yet the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. The walls themselves seemed to be closing in, pressing down on him. The darkness felt like it was alive, suffocating him, whispering things he couldn't understand. Ramirez. The voice came from behind him, low and ragged, the same voice that had been calling to him earlier. He didn't have to turn around. He knew it wasn't one of his squad. It was the pirate captain. "I told you, you're too late." Ramirez felt a cold hand clamp around his chest, like invisible fingers clutching his heart. His breath hitched in his throat, and his legs buckled under him, dropping him to his knees. The pressure was unbearable. It was like drowning, like being dragged down into the abyss of the ship's dark history. But he wasn't alone. Ramirez! Grayson's voice broke through the fog of terror. He was there, just a few feet away. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. But he was. Still alive, still fighting. "Grayson, what happened to—" Ramirez started, but the words caught in his throat. Grayson didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, staring at Ramirez, his eyes haunted. The silence stretched between them for what felt like an eternity before Grayson spoke. We're not alone," he said, his voice trembling. "This ship it's not just cursed, it's alive." Ramirez's heart skipped. He had thought it, of course. The ship had a presence, a malevolent intelligence that bent the very fabric of reality around them. But hearing it spoken aloud made the nightmare feel more real. Grayson looked over his shoulder, as though the shadows themselves were watching him. "We need to find the source of this. We need to stop it." Ramirez's gaze followed Grayson's, and something cold settled in his stomach. Behind Grayson, just beyond the reach of the flickering emergency lights, something was moving. Just out of sight. He couldn't make it out at first, but the shadow shifted, and then he saw it, a door, half open. Beyond it, an ancient crumbling control room. The symbols on the walls were more intricate here, glowing faintly with a sickly green light. The air seemed thicker, charged with an energy that made his skin prickle. "That's the bridge," Grayson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's where it all began." Ramirez nodded, though a sense of dread settled in his bones. He knew this was where the answers lay. He had to go in. They all did. But the closer they got, the more it felt as though something, or someone, was watching them. They moved toward the door, their steps slow and deliberate. The air was colder now, almost unbearable, and the whispers were louder than ever. They didn't come from the walls anymore. They came from the shadows themselves, curling around them like tendrils, wrapping them in a blanket of fear. The room beyond the door was vast, filled with outdated technology, shattered consoles, and pieces of machinery that had long since ceased to function. But in the center of it all was a large, strange altar, a relic of a past so old that even the Black Pearl had forgotten it. The altar was covered in strange symbols, just like the walls, but there was something more here, something darker. A figure stood at the altar. At first, Ramirez thought it was another of the pirate ghosts, but as he took a closer look, his stomach churned. This was different. This was no ghost. This was something older, more powerful. The figure's face was obscured by a heavy, tattered hood, but the energy it exuded was unmistakable. It was the source. The thing that had cast the curse upon the Black Pearl. The creature was not merely a part of the ship, it was the ship, the very heart of its malevolent power. Ramirez's instinct screamed at him to turn back, to flee, but it was too late. The figure slowly raised its head, revealing an empty, hollow face, just like the others. The same sickly green glow from its eyes, but now it was stronger, more intense. "You have no idea what you've walked into," the figure rasped. Its voice was deeper now, more monstrous. It was a fusion of hundreds of voices speaking in unison, and Ramirez felt the words vibrate in his chest. "The curse is not of the pirates' making, it is mine. It was I who bound them to this ship, and I who now bind you." Ramirez's blood ran cold. He knew instinctively that this was the end of the line. The Black Pearl wasn't a ship at all. It was a weapon, a prison, and they were its latest victims. Grayson took a step forward, his voice hoarse with fear. "Who are you?" The figure tilted its head as though considering the question. "I was once the captain of a ship far older than this one," it said, its voice reverberating through the room like thunder. "I had power beyond your comprehension, but it was stolen from me, stolen by the very pirates you've been chasing." "What are you saying?" Ramirez demanded, his voice barely audible, his mind racing. "I am the one who cursed the Black Pearl," the figure continued. "It was I who turned those pirates into specters, into souls trapped between life and death. They will never be free, and neither will you." Ramirez's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the pirates. This was something much worse. Something that had been manipulating the pirates all along, using them as pawns in its own twisted game. "You see," the figure continued, its voice growing louder, "I was once an alien, an entity beyond time, and this ship is not just a relic of piracy. It is a living, breathing weapon, and I have been waiting for centuries, waiting for someone to come and finish what was started." Before Ramirez could respond, the shadows in the room began to twist, warping around them, closing in. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The Black Pearl had heard the call. It had awakened. The figure's eyes glowed brighter. "You are mine now, all of you, forever." The door slammed shut behind them, trapping the Marines inside with the cursed figure. And as the darkness closed in, Ramirez realized the truth. They had never stood a chance. The curse of the Black Pearl was older than they could imagine, and now it was theirs. The air in the control room was thick with malevolent energy, pressing down on Ramirez like an invisible weight. His lungs burned, as if the very atmosphere were suffused with poison, and the whispers, that incessant gnawing on the edges of his consciousness, had grown unbearable. They weren't just voices anymore, they were memories, fragmented, distorted echoes of the ship's cursed past. They crawled through his skull like rats, burrowing into his brain, forcing him to relive the final moments of each dead pirate, each lost soul. But the alien entity, the one who had cursed them all, was worse. It was everywhere. The ship, once a place of life and terror, had now become an extension of the creature. There was no escape, no corner they could turn where they wouldn't be hunted, no place to hide from the thing that had waited for so long. The Marines had entered the belly of the beast, and now it was closing its jaws around them. "You think you can escape this place?" The voice echoed, more powerful now, coming from all around them. It was 1,000 voices, all clamoring for attention, but beneath them was one, a low, guttural growl that sent a tremor through Ramirez's chest. "You are mine, little soldiers. You have come too far, and now you belong to the Black Pearl. To me." Ramirez took a step back, raising his weapon, but he knew deep down it was useless. The weapon was nothing but a tool in the hands of a giant. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his mind raced. The walls of the control room seemed to pulse with a life of their own, rippling like waves in an ocean that had no end. The lights flickered as though the ship was struggling to maintain some semblance of its own existence. This ship, this curse, it is my prison as much as yours, the voice continued, its words like an old scar pulling at the edges of his sanity. "But I am patient. I have waited centuries for this, for you, and now you will pay the price for my vengeance." Grayson's hand trembled as he reached out for the shattered console nearby, pulling himself up, his face gaunt, his eyes wide with terror. This isn't just a ghost ship," he murmured, his voice distant. "It's a tomb for all the souls lost to this place, and we're next. We're going to join them." Ramirez shot him a look, but there was no denying the truth in his words. Grayson wasn't wrong. The ship wasn't just haunted, it was a living, breathing entity. The pirates who had once sailed its cursed waters weren't trapped here by accident. The ship had bound them. It had become a prison, and its captain, the alien entity, had used their souls to fuel its curse. "What do we do now?" Ramirez asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can't just stand here. We need to find a way to stop this thing." The shadows seemed to move at the mention of the word stop, swirling in the corners of the room, gathering like a storm on the horizon. Ramirez's heart raced as he tried to focus. The alien presence was overpowering, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. The ship seemed to bend under its weight, like it was alive, pulsating with an energy that seemed to make the air heavier with each passing second. But there was one thing Ramirez knew. If they didn't act now, they wouldn't leave. They couldn't leave. Not alive, at least. "We need to find a way to destroy it," Grayson said, his voice shaking with fear, but there was a fire in his eyes, a stubbornness that had kept him alive until now. "We need to shut down the heart of the ship, whatever. This thing its power is coming from somewhere, and we need to find it before it consumes us." Ramirez nodded, though the uncertainty gnawed at him. He didn't know how they could destroy a creature like this. The entity was ancient, a force that had existed for millennia, a being beyond anything they could understand. But they had no choice. They had to try. "Let's move out," Ramirez said, his voice gruff. He motioned to the others, but Ortega was still missing. He hadn't forgotten about her. He couldn't. The thought of leaving her behind was unbearable, but there was no time to search. Not now. They had to act. The Marines moved through the ship, their steps echoing through the darkness as they navigated the winding halls. The ship seemed to grow colder with each step, the walls now pressing in on them from all sides, as though they were walking through the veins of a massive creature. Every shadow seemed to hide something. A figure waiting to emerge, a hand reaching. Out from the dark, the whispers followed them, seeping into their minds, clawing at their thoughts. "You will never leave. Join us. You belong to the Pearl." "Shut up," Grayson shouted, his voice a mix of rage and terror as he swung his rifle at the darkness. But there was nothing there. The whispers had no form, no shape. They were the ship itself. It was trying to break them piece by piece. They reached a large central chamber, its doors groaning as they opened, revealing a vast empty space. The ceiling stretched high above them, lost in the shadows. In the center of the room was an enormous, glowing core, its energy pulsing like a beating heart, casting an eerie green glow across the room. The ship's heart. Ramirez's heart skipped. This was it. This was the source of everything. "You think you can stop me?" The voice, deep, cold, and filled with the weight of centuries, came from the walls themselves. It was everywhere inside their heads. "You are too late. The Pearl is mine, and now so are you." The core pulsed, sending a ripple of energy through the room. The air grew heavier, the walls pressing in tighter, as though the very ship were trying to crush them. Grayson stepped forward, his weapon aimed at the core. "We need to destroy it, now." But Ramirez knew it wasn't going to be that easy. No, the ship wasn't going to let them destroy its heart without a fight. This wasn't just a battle for their lives, it was a battle for their souls. Suddenly, the walls around them cracked, and the floor beneath their feet shuddered violently. The core began to hum, a low, resonant sound that reverberated in their bones. Ramirez could feel it. It was drawing them in like a black hole, pulling them closer, consuming them. The lights flickered again, and the shadows twisted, forming into shapes. Pirates, the ghosts of the past. They had come to stop them. Grayson fired first. The shots rang out in the chamber, but the ghosts seemed to vanish as quickly as they appeared. It didn't matter. The shots weren't what they needed. They needed to destroy the core, destroy the source of the curse. Ramirez sprinted toward the core, ignoring the freezing cold that gnawed at his skin, the whispers that tore at his mind. He was close now, so close. And then it hit him. A vision, a flash of memory, something not his own. He was standing on the deck of the Black Pearl, watching as a massive, otherworldly creature tore through the skies. It was the alien, the entity that had cursed them. It had once been something more, a god perhaps, or a demon, but it was trapped now, bound to the ship, its power feeding on the souls it had claimed. The memory slammed into Ramirez like a freight train. The realization struck him. The curse wasn't just on the pirates, it was on the ship itself, and as long as the ship existed, the curse would live on, never ending. He had to destroy the core. He had to destroy the Black Pearl. He reached the core, his hands shaking as he began to set the detonator. But something grabbed him, something cold and unyielding, dragging him back into the shadows. "You can't escape," the voice whispered, curling through his mind. "You belong to the Pearl." Ramirez struggled, but he couldn't break free. The darkness was all around him now, and then, just as everything seemed lost, Grayson's voice cut through the madness. "Ramirez, do it! Do it now!" The detonator clicked, and the world exploded. The explosion tore through the heart of the Black Pearl, sending a shockwave that rattled the very bones of the ship. Ramirez felt the ground tremble beneath him as the room was engulfed in blinding light. His body was thrown backward, his head cracking against the cold metal floor. Pain shot through his skull, but he barely registered it. The whole world seemed to shift, reality itself bending, warping, as the ship groaned and rumbled around him. He gasped for breath, his mind clouded with confusion. Was it over? Had they succeeded? The air felt different now, lighter but colder, as if the weight of centuries had finally been lifted. But something was wrong. He could feel it. The ship wasn't just collapsing, it was changing. The ghosts were gone. The whispers, the eyes watching from the shadows, those had stopped. But there was an eerie silence now, one that felt like it was pregnant with dread. The walls of the Black Pearl groaned one final time, the ship's death rattling. Through every deck, Grayson stumbled to his feet, his face pale and drawn. "Is it over?" His voice cracked, betraying the fear he was struggling to hide. "Did we do it? Did we kill it?" Ramirez looked around, his pulse hammering in his ears. His instincts screamed that something was still wrong, something lurking just out of sight. But before he could speak, there was a deafening bang, and the floor beneath them shuddered violently, nearly throwing them off their feet. "We need to leave," Ramirez said, his voice hoarse. "Now." They had to reach the escape pods. But as the Marines began to move toward the exit, the Black Pearl seemed to rebel. The corridor stretched impossibly long before them, the walls bending and twisting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The ship had once been alive, but now it felt like something worse, like it was dying, thrashing in its final moments, trying to drag them all into the dark. A sudden, chilling realization washed over Ramirez. The ship wasn't just a vessel, it had been a prison. A place to contain the curse that had bound them all, but now it was trying to take them with it. It had been holding them inside all along, but now, in its death throes, it wanted to drag them into oblivion. As they rushed down the hall, Grayson stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes were wide with terror as he stared at the walls. "Ramirez, look at us." Ramirez spun around, panic rising in his chest. What was Grayson talking about? But then he saw it. The reflection. It wasn't just a flicker of light or shadow. No, it was them. Their own faces stared back at them, but they weren't the same. Their features were distorted, twisted by something dark. Eyes that once held the spark of humanity were now shadowed, vacant, filled with the same haunting glow that had marked the pirates who once sailed the Black Pearl. They were changing. "No," Ramirez whispered. "No. This can't be happening." But it was. They weren't just escaping the Black Pearl. They had become a part of it. The curse had followed them. The Black Pearl wasn't finished with them. They hadn't just been haunted. They'd been claimed. Grayson stumbled back, his breath ragged. We "We have to leave. We can't stay here." But Ramirez knew the truth now. The curse wasn't something that could be destroyed by a single explosion. It wasn't a physical entity that could be killed or banished. It was inside them. The souls of the pirates, of the cursed crew, were bound to the Marines. Their violent memories, their anger, their endless hunger for revenge were now a part of them. The ship's last gasp, a final surge of energy, shook the deck, and the emergency lights flickered out, plunging them into total darkness. Then the voice returned. "You will never leave. Not truly. You belong to me. You are mine. Forever." Ramirez's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to scream, to fight it. He had to. But deep down, he knew the truth. It was already too late. The sound of the escape pods activating filled the air, a signal that they were close to reaching their freedom. But even as they moved toward the launch bay, Ramirez could feel it. The curse was still there, crawling beneath his skin, twisting his thoughts. Every step felt like a battle, against the ship, against the entity, and against the part of himself that was no longer him. They reached the pod, and Ramirez didn't hesitate. He slammed his hand on the launch button, and the pod shot away from the dying Black Pearl, tearing through the void of space. The relief that should have come with their escape was hollow. As the pod drifted into the cold expanse of space, Ramirez stared out the viewport, his breath steadying, but what he saw made his blood run cold. The Black Pearl was still there, still floating in space, though its shape had changed. It had no physical form now. It was more like a black cloud, a collection of memories, souls, and shattered remnants of something long forgotten. The curse hadn't died with the ship. It was alive, alive in a way that defied understanding. "We're free," Grayson whispered, his voice shaking. "We made it." Ramirez didn't respond. He couldn't. His eyes were locked on their reflections in the pod's viewport. Their faces, his and Grayson's, were twisted, like the ones they had seen inside the ship. Hollow, empty. The pirates were inside them. The Pearl was with them, its influence far more insidious than they had ever realized. "They're still here," Ramirez whispered. His voice cracked, and he could feel the cold weight of their eyes upon him. Inside him, the pod drifted further into the void, and as their ship's engines hummed softly, the distant stars outside seemed to mock them. They weren't free. They were never going to be free. Not while the curse of the Black Pearl lived. Inside them, and then the pod's engines sputtered, the lights flickered. The reflection of the Black Pearl in the distance seemed to draw closer, and in that moment, Sergeant Ramirez realized the true horror of their situation. The Black Pearl wasn't just a ship, it was a part of them now, and they had never escaped at all.